Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Family News. This is Murray Rundus, the production manager and managing editor here at CFN. And today we're talking about an issue that has come up a lot more recently. I think a lot of people are asking this question. There's a lot of tension around the subject, and that's the Novus Ordo, attendance at the Novus Ordo, and what to do when the traditional Latin Mass goes away. Now, this has come up a lot more recently because we're at a bit of a boiling point because this issue has not yet been addressed by Pope Leo. I expect that's going to be addressed within the first 5 years of the pontificate. I expect it will probably come after Cardinal Roche is replaced. There's going to be probably at least 6 months until that happens. It might even be longer than that. But we haven't seen that addressed yet. And at the same time, we're really feeling the aftershocks and the final wave of the implementation of Traditionis Custodes. And it's coming in a really radical form. You can look at the Diocese of Charlotte, which really put all of the Latin Masses into one very small location. We have an article about that in the paper this month. There was also the incident in Detroit, which was similarly brutal. We saw many traditional Latin Masses just disappear. And we are now seeing an incident similar to all of this in the Diocese of Tulsa, Oklahoma. So all of this is happening. People are losing their traditional Latin Masses. The same thing is going on in Europe and the UK. People are losing Masses. And now this question of the Novus Ordo is being raised by many again. There's many who are trying to defend it. There's many traditionalists who are, of course, angry that they're losing their traditional Latin Masses and are being provided this as an alternative. So this has been boiling up. And I've noticed a lot of the reaction has centered around this one tweet, which is very bizarre. Putting aside the fact the tweet was likely for what we call engagement bait, just really wanting as many people to reply to it as possible. I've seen hundreds of thousands of people either looking at this tweet, retweeting it, also putting it on other social media platforms, which I've seen it also get high numbers on there, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok even, which is this one guy who wanted to go to a traditional Latin Mass for the Nativity of St. John the Baptist. Wanted to go to a solemn high Mass. And when he arrived there, he discovered it was a Novus Ordo. And he says in the tweet that once this happened, he walked out. Now, I think some people were irritated at the engagement bait. Some people thought it was uncouth or something. Putting that all aside, I really want to engage with some of the people who have been attacking that position, him leaving in that scenario, and I think we can use this as a bouncing off point to really get into some of the more deeper issues at play. So firstly, when it comes to him leaving Mass, because I saw a lot of people say this, saying it is a sin to leave Mass. That's something that one cannot do. Well, we firstly have to say that what's the precept of the church that we're talking about? Right, this is what all Catholics have to do, which is attend Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation. Now, we're not going to say that that's necessarily an absolute, because there are circumstances. For example, someone might be deathly ill or even ill enough just to excuse the individual from going to Mass. There might be a Mass too far away, etc., etc. But in this circumstance, we're not even talking about that. And yet I've seen hundreds of people, maybe even thousands, say that this man was sinning for leaving Mass. We're not talking about a holy day of obligation. We're not talking about a Sunday Mass. We're talking about the Nativity of St. John the Baptist, which ironically is a higher classed feast in the traditional Latin Mass. But either way, it's not a holy day of obligation. There was no obligation to attend Mass on that day. Now, I think some people are saying this because of a conversation that often gets brought up with priests, which is that people sometimes ask, can I leave Mass after going to communion? Should I leave Mass after going to communion? And this is a big problem at the Novus Ordo. It's not something I've ever seen at the traditional Latin Mass. I've never seen somebody go up to communion, receive it, and then run out of the church. When I used to attend the Novus Ordo frequently, I saw that all the time. It used to devastate me. You'd see half the church leave. You'd see a quarter of the church leave even at reverent Novus Ordo parishes. You'd see a quarter of the parish leave. And so that's something priests will often say is, no, you need to stay at the full Mass. But again, we're not talking about a holy day of obligation. We're not talking about a Sunday even. We're talking about the Nativity of St. John the Baptist. So there's obviously not I don't think we can say he didn't meet a holy day of obligation. He didn't meet a Sunday obligation. Now, here's a more important, a more thoughtful point that gets brought up, and this is worth some more conversation, which is that disrespectful to the Blessed Sacrament? And I think that's a more thoughtful consideration to give. I think this is something worthy of a bit more attention than the previous argument of saying he missed an obligation somehow. Is this disrespectful to the Blessed Sacrament? Well, I think we first have to take note that there is a difference between the sacrament and the ceremony. And the reason I say this is because you can have a rite, a liturgical rite, and oftentimes they are connected with the presence of a sacrament. But the rite itself, you can have various ceremonies that are disconnected from the actual sacrament. And this is seen very clearly as well in non-Catholic valid liturgies. To use a very extreme example, so this is not a one-to-one comparison with what this man did by leaving the Novus Ordo, you might have a priest who is a real priest, so he's actually, when he says the words of consecration, that becomes the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, but he's outside of the church, and maybe he's a heretic. Well, if that ceremony in and of itself, even if it's a valid Mass, that is not something a Catholic should attend. It would be scandalous for a Catholic to actively participate in a liturgy like that. The Catholic, of course, has no obligation to stay at any kind of liturgy like that. An example I want to give to sort of illustrate this point, and we can see how some liturgies, based on the priest involved, based on various circumstances going on at the parish, would be scandalous enough to one's faith to have to leave. I want to point out Father James Martin. Father James Martin, this is somebody, and this is a bit of a cliche now to bring this up. People are always bringing up Father James Martin, but it's something that is worthy of being pointed out. This was a man promoted by Pope Francis, met with Pope Francis on many different occasions, and doesn't seem to have ever been reprimanded. Quite the contrary, actually. Well, he recently had Pete Buttigieg on his podcast, and on there he praised him. And Pete Buttigieg is a homosexual, quote unquote, married man who has adopted children. And Father James Martin was encouraging his parenting. He was encouraging this kind of relationship. He said that it's wonderful that it's an actual that he's learning about the love of the Father through parenting in this homosexual marriage.
Now that I've got kids.
No, that's beautiful. So understanding the Father's pain for his son on the cross.
Yeah, because I think at least most American liberal Christians, I think it's safe to say, to the extent that we have affinity or identity in the Holy Trinity, it's mostly the Son that we're relating to, right? And that's kind of, in a way, the point of the arrival of the incarnate figure of Jesus Christ, a little more relatable than the God the Father of the Old Testament. Maybe this is just the way of the world, but now I'm in my 40s and I'm a father, and I'm starting to better align with the style that is presented, the style of love and the style of concern that we associate with God the Father.
That's beautiful. I mean, it really does. It's an entree into the Trinity, right? Into that relational aspect of the Trinity.
Now, if somebody can look at that and say, well, this is a man who, if I was going to his Mass and I was attending his Mass and hearing what he has to say at the sermon, that's completely safe. I don't think that is safe. I think that's actually dangerous to one's faith, and I think that's really contrary to the purpose of Mass. Another example I'll give is another this has become a sort of viral example of these sort of LGBTQ masses, and we've seen more and more of these really throughout the United States, where we see liberal priests not being reprimanded for this kind of thing. The videos that are on the screen right now are Catholic churches. They're not Episcopalian. Now, if you went to one of these and you saw that the pride flags were everywhere, you see all of this liberal imagery. You see all of these things that are scandalizing one's faith. You know, transgenders, openly transgender people are preaching to the parish. I think that's something where if one stepped into that place, you would say, "I'm leaving." Even if the bishop approved this mass, it's not something that would be healthy for a Catholic to attend. And it's simply a fact nowadays that this does happen. You see scandalous liturgical abuses that are nevertheless approved by the episcopate. This is not something that one should attend, even if the Eucharist is truly present at these ceremonies. It's still not an excuse to go to these places and participate in those ceremonies. Now, something important to recognize as well is that the sacraments work ex opere operato. And so that means that they are from the work worked, from the work performed, rather than from the holiness of the priest, for example. Now, that's something that gets brought up often. People say, well, it's still Jesus and the Blessed Sacrament, even if there are all these circumstances around it. But an important thing to recognize is that even though the sacraments are ex opere operato, the way that we grow in devotion is oftentimes not ex opere operato. That's something where we actually have to work with our dispositions in order to change our habits, in order to have a better inclination towards God. Now, the way this is done, in order to grow in that devotion, right, that active response to our Lord Jesus Christ, we usually have to do this through attending the church's liturgy in a thoughtful and prayerful way. And so to some of these apologists who are speaking of the liturgy as this is some kind of legal tribute that has to be made, you have to go through a sort of penance where you close your eyes, you close your ears, and you're scandalized by everything going on around you. The priest is preaching heresy. The mass is completely irreverent. But you just have to close your eyes, go up there, receive communion, and that's how you grow in devotion. Quite the contrary. Almost every church father that speaks about this, that speaks about the outlines of growing in that devotion, of growing in that prayerfulness, that prayerful attentiveness, says that we need to use the liturgy as a training ground, not in that deformed sort of sense, but we're using it because we're actually centering ourselves in the liturgical environment. We're looking at the text. We're paying close attention to the text. We're actually focusing all of our energy onto the text and what is being presented to us. And that by having that attentiveness to God in that environment, that's a sort of workshop. It's a sort of gymnasium, a training ground, so that when we leave Mass, we're growing in that habit of centering ourselves on God, on holy things, and raising our minds and hearts to God. If we're deforming that and saying this is just a legal tribute that has to be made, you go and experience this hardship at the Mass, just trying to get through the heretical sermon, the altar girls, the irreverence. That's not the way to go about the liturgy. But let's not use such an extreme example. And this is an example that I gave initially to some people, which is that let's say you had an everyday Catholic going to a normal Mass. He's going to what he thinks is a normal Mass, and he walks into a Syro Malankara Divine Liturgy. Now, for those who don't know, the Syro Malankara are a separate rite of the Church, valid liturgy, and they're fully Catholic, and their liturgy is great, but it's very foreign to your everyday Catholic who is going to Mass. Let's say he's going on a weekday. He goes in on a weekday Divine Liturgy, and he's a little bit taken aback. He wasn't expecting what he's seeing in front of him, and so he leaves after really not knowing where he was. It might have been in a foreign language. he didn't know what he was getting into. He leaves. I don't think anybody could say that that individual was sinning. And I don't think he's even sinning if he's taken aback by what he's seeing at the Syro-Malankara Divine Liturgy. The rites are supposed to be very different from one another. They're different expressions of the Catholic Church's worship, and they're oftentimes very different. They're meant for different peoples of the world that have developed their own liturgical characteristics, and the ones that the West are very much so used to are very different from those in the East. It takes completely different dispositions. Imagine if we took a medieval Roman Catholic from France and we abducted him and then took him to the middle of Russia and showed him a Russian divine liturgy. Well, he'd probably be a bit taken aback. Or if we took him to the Middle East and we showed him a Syriac liturgy or a Maronite liturgy, he might be a bit taken aback, and that's completely to be expected. We shouldn't be, I think, being as harsh to people who are taken aback by a liturgy that is foreign to them, a rite that is foreign to them. And the fact is, in this case, the Novus Ordo is a different rite from the traditional Latin Mass. And it's completely to be expected that one going to the rite that he wishes to attend and finds a rite that's completely different might be taken aback. And in the same way that one might go to a Syro-Malankara liturgy and be taken aback there. The Roman rite, despite what has all been said, is not the Novus Ordo. If we're actually saying that words have any sort of meaning in and of themselves, well, the Roman rite, I think, is referring to certain characteristics. It's referring to the cycle of readings. It's referring to the character of the offertory. We had a TikTok that we put out recently going over some of the characteristics that Dr. Peter Kwasniewski gave in the once and future Roman Rite. I think looking at those characteristics, we see that the Novus Ordo really changed almost every single element that makes the Roman Rite the Roman Rite. So this is a different rite entirely, unless we're just saying that each of the names of the rite are an arbitrary legal definition. And so I think it's completely to be expected that one goes to a rite that he's expecting, finds it's a different one, is taken aback and leaves. I don't think there's anything that one that we can speak in judgment of him over that for. I also want to point out that even if this was a Sunday, all of this judgment towards this man is not warranted, because he could have said, well, I went to this Mass and I wasn't expecting this to be a Novus Ordo. Well, instead I'll go to St. Catherine's down the street, or St. Joseph's, or whatever the church is. I know they have a traditional Latin Mass. I know they have another kind of Mass. Everyone's speaking in judgment as if this man just refused to go to Mass, period. But that might not have been the case. He might have gone to a different Mass, even if this was a Sunday, which in this incident it was not. What about the disdain? I've seen some people talk about this. Some people got very irritated at this. Well, there's a disdain for the Mass. Okay, your Syro-Malankara example, so be it. But could you have disdain for the Syro-Malankara? Well, on one level, I think that it's natural that different rites have different, that people have different tastes towards them. I've known people who are very, who are simply unable to get into Eastern liturgies. They find them repulsive in some ways because they're so foreign to a Western mindset. And again, I think this is just sort of natural. And, I'm not bringing up the Eastern Catholic liturgies for no reason. I think this is actually very important, especially to understand the crisis we face in the West. We can look to the East for some sort of precedent on this, and we see the importance of it. Pope Leo XIV even is constantly praising the great spiritual tradition of the East and the liturgical tradition of the East. And when we start to understand that the Novus Ordo is a different rite, and the traditional Latin Mass is its own rite, well, off the bat, even before considering some of the doctrinal problems, we can understand the difficulty of this, the real difficulty. Just as the Eastern Catholic has a right to celebrate his divine liturgy, and that's a tradition that should be preserved, in a similar way, the traditional Latin Mass should be preserved, not only because this is the inheritance of the saints of the West, but because this is a different rite, this is a different spiritual tradition, and it deserves to be maintained and preserved. But I also want to point out a glaring hypocrisy that is just clearly present, which is that many of the people either criticizing the traditional Catholics or trying to defend every jot and tittle of the Novus Ordo, at the same time hold a number of Eastern Orthodox men to be saints. And they do this because they believe in the infallibility of canonizations. They, to an extent that even if a man is seen as a saint in Eastern Catholic churches and has been permitted to be seen as a saint, they believe that that's infallible. And so they'll see men like Gregory Palamas or Photius as being saints. And these men detested certain aspects of the Latin liturgical tradition. Unleavened bread, for example, clean-shaven priests, and especially saying the Filioque in the Creed. And yet those men are saints. And again, I'm not saying that to try to defend those men, but I'm bringing out a precedent here that there is a clear hypocrisy in celebrating those men as saints when they had no problem criticizing certain aspects of liturgical tradition. Holding them up to be saints, there's a clear disconnect there. My point in bringing up the Eastern Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, the Eastern liturgies in general, is to firstly show that liturgy is a matter of doctrine. There's an integral connection between doctrine and liturgy. And and how we express doctrine is going to be connected not only with our devotional connection with Jesus Christ, but it's also going to be connected with our understanding of the faith. But I also bring this up to say that there's always been disagreement about liturgical rites within the church. Different traditions have been fighting other traditions. I think that the one that has existed for 2,000 years should be given a greater amount of respect than the one that we see in the Novus Ordo, which Cardinal Ratzinger, then Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, called a banal fabrication. This is something that was not received and approved, which I think is a major standard that we can use for determining if a liturgy is going to be life-giving. If it's a received and approved rite of the church, if it's being passed down as a part of tradition. Dr. Peter Kwasniewski's books do a great job of showing this, and you can look to some of the older Catholic liturgical books on this. For example, Father Fortescue's book shows that there was a true development of receiving and approving these liturgies over time, rather than just fabricating them out of the blue. And that's really the big crux of this as well. Not only is the Novus Ordo changing or abolishing, removing everything that makes the Roman Rite, or at least very close to that, but it's also touching and removing things that were behind the doctrinal explanations of the Council of Trent. So everything that's associated with those doctrinal explanations at Trent, especially in session 22 of the Council of Trent, we see those things removed, taken out, changed. And that should be troublesome. Many people use what's on the screen here. This is the 22nd session of the Council of Trent as a way to defend the Novus Ordo. But I actually think using this text as a sort of, well, in biblical apologetics, it's called a proof text, or in patristic apologetics too, of, basically searching everywhere and just finding one sentence that proves your point. This doesn't work. And it actually proves, I think, the traditionalist point that this is not looking at the spirit behind everything. This is looking in a sort of legalistic slavishness. And I want to point out, this is the canon people often use. They say, if anyone saith that the ceremonies, vestments, and outward signs, which the Catholic Church makes use of in the celebration of masses, are incentives to impiety rather than offices of piety, let him be anathema. And so people say, you're doing this with the Novus Ordo, and because of that, you're sinning. No. I think people would do well to actually read what the session is referring to. The canon is not isolated. The canon is not, the canon's not talking about the Novus Ordo. The canon is talking about received and approved rites of the church. But what's it talking about? Well, it's talking about what the session is speaking of, which is mainly things that the Novus Ordo was completely opposed to, which I think many people have a problem with. So, just a quick example. on not celebrating the Mass everywhere in the vulgar tongue, the mysteries of the Mass to be explained to the people. So again, this even right here, you see an explanation. Yes, just as you have in traditional parishes, people should receive the knowledge of the mysteries of the Mass. They should have it explained to them. It should not be in the vulgar tongue. You also see on Mass wherein the priest alone communicates. This is something that's shunned upon, looked down upon, because you see even in St. Peter's Basilica with Pope Francis, priests aren't allowed to celebrate Mass alone on those side altars. It's encouraged con-celebration. Almost every single one of these various chapters that are looking on things that are backing what the traditional Latin Mass is expressing doctrinally. Almost all of these things the Novus Ordo is opposed to. And I think that's a huge problem. If the Novus Ordo is to be defended, where you're defending the use of the vernacular, you're defending the use of altar girls, you're defending the use of all of these various things, you're going to end up in a point where you're going to be against the 22nd session, even if we go away from something like altar girls and you're talking about the removal of certain parts of the Mass. Either looking at the offertory, for example, or the various gestures and ceremonies, which this is referring to, what I showed here, the outward signs. So you might think about the genuflection immediately after the consecration of the host. Well, that's removed. What is the excuse to remove that, if not violating Canon 7? And so I actually think that those who use this argument, who use this 22nd session of the traditional of the Council of Trent, actually in a sense anathematize themselves. Now, to make a sort of conclusion or to come at some overarching point, I wish that we Catholics, and I think we would do a much better job to do this, if whenever we look at law, when we look at liturgy, when we look at doctrine, all of that should be subordinated to and should ultimately be related to growing in devotion and growing in a relationship with Jesus Christ. I don't think that's a Protestant thing to say. I don't think it's Protestant to say that all of the aspects of our faith that is practiced should ultimately lead to a better relationship with Jesus Christ. The salvation of souls is the point of the law. And if we're not accepting that, I think we're getting close to disrupting an overarching point of the Gospels, which is to say that the law is not good in and of itself, but it must be fulfilled. It must be fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And if we're just saying that ecclesiastical law should be followed for the sake of ecclesiastical law, to the detriment of our personal faith, to our personal following the doctrine of the Church, I think that gets to be a huge issue. I think we run right into disrupting the sources of revelation itself and what our Lord clearly states in the Gospels. And so this is not to be seen as, well, the authority should just be completely disregarded. But I think we have to say, just by looking at the facts of the matter, that there are certain circumstances where one's personal salvation, one's personal growth in devotion, security of one's sanctity of soul, can come into conflict with what is legal on paper. So I gave the example of, well, Father James Martin, that is a Mass approved by the bishop. That's something the bishop doesn't have a problem with. Father Martin was given promotions by Pope Francis. Shouldn't we assume that everything is fine? Well, no, I think we have to use our common reason, backed up by the magisterium of the Church, by the reasons given by the magisterium of the Church, to say, this is wrong, this should be avoided. Now, there are many groups around today, and many people take positions to avoid having to run into this conflict. You see people that are called post-traditionalists. Those are people who have usually were traditionalists and they left, and now they take something like what is called the Pope-splainer position. That's a sort of, a derogatory moniker that is given to them. But the reason why they take that position is because they cannot stand the gray area that results from saying that there is sometimes a disconnect between what is legal on paper and what is actually good for one's soul. And so they'll go any kind of which way to try to justify what is coming out of the mouths of the hierarchy, or Pope Francis, or now Pope Leo, which has been somewhat of a change, definitely, from Pope Francis. But the reason they take that position is because they don't like that gray area. I think it's necessary that we embrace that gray area nowadays, because I think that's what the facts demand us to do. And the way we embrace it is by going back to focusing on our own personal devotion, to growing in that response to Jesus Christ. And in order to do that, we need to have those tools that the fathers tell us to go to, which is a safe liturgy, safe community, safe spiritual fathers. And that's something that many times it simply cannot be provided for at your local parish. Now, your local parish might have a traditional Latin Mass. There might be Eastern liturgies that can provide that for you. But I think many people, and myself included, cannot find that growth without absolute scandal choking one's own faith, one's own growth in devotion at your local Novus Ordo parish. It simply cannot be found. I think we would do better as Catholics, no matter what position we take on the crisis in the church, because there's many different positions one takes. You can look at sedevacantists, you can look at people who take what is called the recognize and resist position, even though that's a derogatory moniker in and of itself. If you're a post-traditionalist, if you're a conservative Catholic, an Eastern Catholic, I think we should all aim for, and I think we could do much better if, rather than making arguments from authority that are meant really only to preserve making our arguments and our positions internally consistent, so there's no contradictions between the law and the authority. Rather than focusing so much on that, I think we need to go back to, is what is in front of us, are our positions making us grow in devotion? Is it leading to a spiritual stability? And is it leading us to understand the faith better? Because the thing I think that has to be avoided at all cost is where we separate faith and reason, where we start saying that I believe in the Catholic faith, but when I practice the faith at my local parish, it doesn't express what I actually believe. But I sort of put my blinders on and have that legal tribute that I'm making. Or if I say that I believe in the Catholic faith, I think it is completely reasonable. I don't see how this can all be reconciled. This is a clear contradiction with what is going on at my local parish. I'm just going to put the blinders on and say my reason doesn't matter. My understanding of the faith doesn't matter. I'm going to go anyway. Rather, I would like to see us say, if one wants to defend the Novus Ordo, let him do it based on defending the reforms themselves. In that case, I think one's going to run into problems with the 22nd session of Trent, with Trent in general, with the spirit behind Trent. But I think that would be more beneficial, and I respect that position more. I don't think I don't see that being done as much anymore. I see a lot of excusing the reforms. I don't see people actually advocating for the reforms. When it comes to traditional Catholics, I think we would do better if, rather than trying to, again, make our positions as internally consistent as possible, if we actually focus on what is the traditional Latin Mass doing for people. And I've seen what it does for people. I'm sure many of our audience or many of our listeners know as well, and have seen it, that it does provide that spiritual stability. It provides that spiritual growth, and it is a perfect place in order to exercise one's devotion and to grow in that relationship with Jesus Christ, in that full understanding of the magisterial teaching of the Church. And I think that's what I would like us to focus on more and more. So, from here at Catholic Family News, we have many videos on the new Mass. Some of them in particular are called the Mass Explained series. You can go see these full edited videos over on catholicfamilynews.locals.com. It compares the Novus Ordo and the traditional Latin Mass. Brian McCall does a great job over there. We're going to have more of those coming out soon. We're also talking about the Diocese of Charlotte in our monthly paper, which you can also get $6 a month over at catholicfamilynews.locals.com. We talk about these things a lot, but I hope there's been some insight that you've gained by watching this video in particular. So from all of us here at Catholic Family News, may God grant you many joyful years.